Conspirinormal, where the nexus of conspiracy theory and the paranormal meet. And now, we join the show already in progress with your hosts, Adam and Seraphiel.
All right, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal.
On the eve of the conference, pretty much.
Yeah, as you're hearing this, it's the eve of the it's not the eve of the conference. We're putting it out after, but we hope it was a good conference.
Yeah, it was really great seeing all you guys, man. Finally meeting a lot of my favorite authors.
Yes. So, if you are new, welcome to Conspirinormal. I'll say why we said that later on, but we're going straight to the guests as we usually do. And this is someone that will be with us at the Strange Realities Conference, or has been with us, or however it works through the time travel, space-time continuum. But actually local Tennessean. He's only about 100 miles away from where we are. And that's Brent Raynes. Welcome to Conspirinormal.
Thank you very much, Adam. I appreciate it. I feel like we're time traveling here. This is incredible.
Yeah, there's definitely some time travel all the time with podcasting. That's for sure, man. But you have written a book about John Keel, but I want to talk a little bit about you before we get to talking about the book and your relationship with Keel. And first of all, the book is called John A. Keel, the Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. But let's get some of your background, how you got into all this, as we call it, weird stuff.
Well, as a young boy, I was, interested in the possibility of life in space. My dad had built me a little playhouse that I converted into a like an astro lab as a kid. I had cut a hole out one of the walls there where I could put a telescope through and look at Venus. And, I thought, it was really cool. Watched a lot of science fiction. And one day I read this book, Flying Saucers Serious Business by Frank Edwards, which a lot of people I have talked to started out with that book. And I had seen him on television on one of the daytime talk shows and talking about some case over in some foreign country, I think, where there was someone had encountered a little being. And so that intrigued me. And so about January 1967, at age 14, I decided what I later heard was called ufologist. I decided to become a ufologist. I started collecting all the information I could get my hands on whenever I'd go to a grocery store or bookstore. I would be checking the racks for, something to do with UFOs. It might have been the National Enquirer or Fate magazine or just whatever, but I'd look for those little headlines, UFOs. And back then there were quite a few. And of course, back in '67, there was quite a bit of activity still. '66 was considered the real active year by a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
But '67 was too. And so pretty soon I started corresponding with people, and I began to reach out to people, and I started after a little over a year, I guess, I started a little mimeograph magazine called Sauceritis, and it was something I'd seen when I was going to the library and a local newspaper office, that they had the microfiche, all these old stories that went back like 1947 to the very beginning of the modern flying saucer era, and looked up, looking for local stories, which I did find some. And then I looked during other active periods, including even 1896 and 97, 1909 and 1910.
Yeah, like the airship stuff.
Yeah, I did a little research on that too. And I even corresponded with one of my first correspondents was Lucius Farish, who had done a lot of research and written a lot of articles that were published on the airship wave. He was a collector of newspapers stories. He in fact, he lived out in Plumerville, Arkansas, and he used to, for quite a number of years, he would publish a monthly news clipping service just on UFO reports. And he had a lot of correspondence, so he got quite a bit of material that came into him, not just here in the United States, but England and Australia and places. And he also started the Eureka Springs UFO Conference. And
that's a big one.
Yeah, and I finally met up with him there while he was still alive. In 2007, I went out there myself and was a vendor and attended the talks, did some interviews with some of the speakers, and I got to do an interview with him as well. It was nice to finally be able to meet someone face to face that I had written to so much over the years. But anyway, that's how I got started, was just, this feeling like there had to be something to it, and my initial reaction was just, that it was an either or simple little proposition. It was either, like the Air Force said, there was just misidentification of Venus on the horizon and airplanes and such and weather balloons, or else there was something truly strange to it, that there were these craft that could land and leave marks on the ground, that they were beings, and they would have been extraterrestrial. But then as I delved into it further, then I started reading articles by authors who proposed alternative theories too. So the situation began to become a little more involved and a little more complicated than I had originally judged it to be.
So what was the tipping point for you on that? What was the point where you said there's more going on here than the physical nuts and bolts craft, so to speak? Like where did you kind of start to part that there's more going on?
Well, I started corresponding personally with John Keel in October of '69.
Well, that's early. So you would have been like 16, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
16, 17.
Wow.
And I had been reading his articles. He hadn't actually published a book on UFOs yet. That came the following year. But his articles were exploring, the idea of cases where there were entities that could, that he believed weren't just extraterrestrial. They could be from a parallel world. He provided, he talked about electromagnetic fields, energy, what he called the superspectrum, or came to call the superspectrum, that, physicists today talk about dark energy, dark matter embedded within, a field that we can't quite see yet and verify, but they're speculating there's something there. And he was speculating that there was something there as well, and that we might be dealing with interactions, intrusions from a parallel world. And he called these beings ultra-terrestrials instead of extraterrestrials. And his speculations really, at that time, the UFO field was a little over 2 decades officially. and a lot of people weren't too happy with his ideas and thought he was just kind of a little too woo-woo. But I thought, well, this is certainly interesting, and he's touching upon things that could explain a lot of areas that haven't been addressed. So I read his materials with great interest, as well as what evolved with Jacques Vallée, because Jacques Vallée in '69 came out with a book called Passport to Magonia that explored hundreds of stories of landings and craft, beings, and also the little people fairy lore, and drawing attention to the similarities, as Keel did, with elemental beings and Marian apparitions, and showing that there were religious, mythic contexts that had certain similarity with what's being reported in our modern times. So that's where it began for me, and Keel was really tackling this area very hot and heavy. And
did you ever actually meet him in person, or was it just like correspondence?
I never did. I wanted to, and we wrote a lot of letters. In fact, I've talked with Doug Skinner, a friend of his in New York, who maintains the johnkeel.com website, and I've talked with him recently about submitting some of my Keel letters to be posted on there. He's got a lot of materials that he's posted from Keel's, what he could gather from Keel's files, letters and pictures and articles, clippings and things, which gets visited a lot by people who are interested in John Keel, of course. And so I'm hoping that, I'll do this, and that maybe he can use some of those letters, and perhaps other people who also have files with John Keel letters in them will also, send them on to him, and he'll maybe post them on his website as well. There seems to be more and more interest in Keel and his ideas, and these letters may offer some things that aren't, generally known, or I know a lot of times he would write things and say, just kind of keep this to yourself. No sense in stirring up the UFO buffs any more than they already are, So, but anyway, that's how it began for me. And so the book here is part biographical, and then it's also got interviews with people like myself who had some connection with Keel or were exploring some of his ideas, expanding on, the research and investigations, exploring the ongoing activity or situation. And so anyway, that was just what I wanted to do. I mean, I had been, I've been going at this, it'll be going on 53 years now.
Wow.
And yeah, and so I've gathered my own data, and so I wanted to present cases that I had looked into that bore similarity to the things that Keel had explored. I corresponded quite a bit with Keel by letter, and at one time by email until he got fed up with the internet. And also we talked on the phone a number of occasions, and it was, it was always very interesting. He was always very informative, and I always felt privileged and honored, to have some interaction with him, because I really, I feel like if it hadn't been for connecting with Keel and reading his writings, that I probably would have eventually, if the ET thing had been it, I probably would have just got kind of bored with it and moved on,
Sure. Yeah. That's the thing that people don't understand about us that have this viewpoint, where the mainstream ufology, and it's starting to change, but the mainstream ufology that believes, we're dealing with kind of like aliens from another planet, they think that we're just saying that there's nothing to it, or that we're kind of denigrating that whole idea. But like, when you really get into the weeds of the alternate stuff,
so there's more to it.
There's way more to it, and it's even more crazy and even more amazing than somebody from Zeta Reticuli.
And that's why the whole situation hasn't I don't think been properly addressed. I when I got into the field and Keel started his investigations, which was around 1966, and he was exploring the ET thing at the time, but by 1967 he had been becoming more deeply involved, traveling through different states, interviewing multiple witnesses, and looking at the contact experience situation. And he began to realize there were a lot of psychic paranormal underpinnings to this activity that was going on, and it was more complex and perplexing than the general vision that the mainstream nuts and bolts ufologists had. It was far more, and I think in this day and time, because I'm getting a really good reception to my book. There's a lot of interest in what Keel wrote and said. Back then, he was such a controversial figure, and a lot of ridicule was heaped upon him. And I think now that people are looking at the deeper elements of consciousness and physics and are saying, hey, this is quite possible. And there are people who really are looking for the answers in that area. I know I've even interacted in recent years with a number of people, PhD psychologists and neuroscientists and astrophysicists, and they're looking at all this stuff. But a lot of them are waiting until their retirement years, but they want to know what Keel was exploring. And I've been asked to write a chapter on just John Keel for an upcoming book of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation of Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters. I wrote a chapter for their Beyond Reality book, which was like 800 something pages, various submissions, dealing with all these alternative areas of ufology and the UFO experience. And they're putting out another one where they're going to explore all these different theories. And I was asked to do one on Keel's theories and his investigations and the alternative areas he looked into.
So let's talk about Keel, and let's start with how Keel became fascinated by this material. What drew him to it?
Well, Keel was, as a young boy, he described himself as an insatiable reader, a reading machine. He read a lot on humor, science, travel, aviation, and magic. He was very interested in sleight of hand magic, something that he pursued all the years of his life. But at one time, as a young boy, he thought about becoming a stage magician. But he liked reading on all kinds of subject matter, and back when he was only 14, he was born in 1930 in New York State near Buffalo. He began writing a column called "Scraping the Keel." There was a little humor in there too, and it was a weekly column. He got $2 a week, which I guess back then was pretty good money. And it was published in Perry, New York, Perry Herald. And then when he was 17, he hitchhiked his way to New York City. He decided he wanted to be a writer. He hadn't even graduated high school yet. But with 75 cents in his pocket and with, I think, a little box with personal belongings, he hitchhiked over 200 miles and ended up in Greenwich Village. Became an associate editor for Quarterly Poets of America from 47 to 49, and began to write for other different magazines and radio stations, and did anything he could to get his name out there. And then in 1951, he got drafted in the Army, and they noticed that he wrote a lot. So he actually became a journalist working for the American Forces Network in Frankfurt, Germany.
Oh, really?
And he got to do various, he did a segment on travel. People in Europe loved his programs. And he spent a night in doing a live broadcast from the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And he also did a program, I think around Halloween at the Frankenstein Castle in Germany. He had a reporter out in a forested area, and they were telling the legends of the stories that were made up about Frankenstein and stuff. Got the reporter that was out by himself all worked up. And then they had somebody, I think, come out of the woods in a costume and scare him, a live broadcast. But, and after that, when he left the Army, he was a foreign radio correspondent in places like Paris and Berlin and Rome and Egypt. And in 1954, he started a journey from Egypt, going through Syria and Baghdad and Tibet, India.
Something you basically could not do today.
Yeah. And it was kind of rough back then too. And he ended up eventually, after several months, in Singapore. And then he went to Barcelona, and he took all of the stuff that he'd been writing and wrote a book called Jadoo, which Jadoo means black magic, the Hindi word for black magic in the East. He had met all these marvelous street performers who pretended that they were great, performers of black magic, or could do these tricks, levitation and so on. And as a magician himself who studied magic, he was able to learn all these different tricks that they performed and how they deceived people with their various tricks, snake handling and the Indian rope trick and being buried alive. And he studied and sometimes he paid some money to different people to find out, well, tell me your secrets, And this is all in his book, Jadoo, Mysteries of the Orient. He made it was a very difficult journey. He started out, he had an editor in New York that he would try to send articles to pay his way. And sometimes he would get stuck, practically starving, until the next check came in. It's something most of us would never consider doing, let's face it. But that's the way he traveled, and there were some pretty scary events on the way. But the main thing was that while he was able to explain many of the things that he observed, there were some things that he couldn't explain. And he had a natural curiosity about so many different areas. And one was a holy man that he said read his mind, could tell him what he was thinking. And he asked the guy, how do you do this? And he says, well, I can explain how I've done it, or how we do it, but he says it would take years and years for you to develop this ability in yourself. And so that's in the book. He was also in a temple where there was a Buddhist temple where this man claimed he could call in the spirits. And there were a number of odd things that happened, but one of the main things was this three-legged wooden stool that came out of one of the corners of the temple and circled around a chair where Keel was sitting. And Keel, reached around it, checked for strings, and he expected to find something, but he couldn't find any explanation. And then it went back to another corner, and then the session was over, so he walked over and he picked up the stool and he looked for any kind of trickery he could find and never could find it. And he also heard reports of the Yeti while he was over there. That was his first real experience with a cryptid investigation. Every time on his journey, his hike through these different villages, he would get there just after the people described this Yeti, and he found footprints. He heard what was said to be the call of the creature. And
really?
And at one time, he saw this creature on the other end of a lake, and some of the locals were saying, "There it is! It's there's the Yeti," but he couldn't be sure because it was such a distance, and he thought it might have been a bear. An editor tried to convince him to say, "Yeah, Yeti's popular. Just say it was it was a Yeti, Mr. Keel." But he said, "No, I can't really truthfully do that."
That's real interesting. With that background in stage magic and studying these kind of tricksters, do you think that had a lot to do with the fact that he went so much deeper than so many people because he's able to because after removing all the artifice, he still found core things that were unexplainable.
Yeah, and he liked a good mystery. He was actually a reader of Charles Fort,
Yeah.
and who wrote a lot of stories of unexplained phenomena. And of course, the early reader of Ray Palmer's amazing stories that later became, who he also became in 1948 associated with Fate magazine, dealing with unexplained things.
Oh yeah.
And of course, even his amazing stories, a science fiction magazine, a lot of people are writing in with stories even prior to 1947 about UFO type phenomena or underground civilizations. There was the whole Richard Shaver mystery.
Yeah, the Darrows and stuff. Yeah.
Yes. So, he was pursuing all of that. He even attended a meeting in 1948 in New York City where about 40 people were getting into a heated argument about whether the government was covering up the flying saucer mystery. So in 1966, Keel had made real good on a real humorous book that he had written. It was a comedy, a spy spoof thing, kind of a James Bond type thing where, all the girls were falling head over heels of this guy. And he sold about 800,000 copies and made pretty good on royalties and all. So he decided at that point, because UFOs were quite an interesting thing, and he had had a couple sightings himself, that this is what he would investigate. And he actually went to the Pentagon, felt he was getting the runaround for him, and they told him there was nothing to this, Mr. Keel. And he said, well, I've seen the things myself, so don't give me that, you can't fool me with that one. So, and he was going to write an article in Playboy magazine, but Dr. Hynek beat him to it. So anyway, instead what he did was he continued on, and he drove across country to about 20 different states and interviewed quite a number of people. Claimed in his book UFOs Operation Trojan Horse, that was published in 1970, that he had interviewed or made some kind of contact with over 200 contact experiencers. And this probably came about because he had an article that was published in True magazine early in '67 called "Never Mind the Saucer, Did You See the Guys Who Were Driving?" And at the time, stories of contacts, beings stepping out of UFOs, missing time was not real popular with the mainstream ufology. That would come years later with Whitley Strieber and Bud Hopkins and such. But anyway, this article really got quite a response. A few weeks after it came out, he was called by the editor to come down to his office. Keel walked in, asked him what was going on, and the guy waved to a corner and said, "You got some mail." And Keel said there were about 6 mail bags with thousands of letters, many of them describing encounters with UFOs and beings, even missing time. And he said at that time, stories like that in magazines had been kind of a no-no, but he realized this was what he wanted to explore, and he did. And what he found convinced him that the subject was far more complex and mysterious than he had initially, judged it to be. He thought initially that, he was going to follow the mainstream extraterrestrial hypothesis or theory, and instead he began to develop a more unusual line of thinking.
So we get to the Mothman prophecies, and we get to Mothman. That's the most famous one associated with Keel. Yeah,
it's the Mothman prophecies. 1975 was when it was published.
Yeah, great book. One of my favorite books ever. I love that book. I mean, it had a big influence on me and my thinking.
Well, it came out, in 75, and it described how, he had made, I believe, about 5 different extended trips to Point Pleasant, West Virginia and the surrounding area, investigating cryptids. Mainly the one we hear most of is, of course, the Mothman, but there was also Bigfoot and kind of a headless man type figure.
I haven't heard that one. I've never heard that part.
Well, it's and then there's a lot of shadow people are apparently being described by people around the TNT area. Rosemary Guiley, who wrote the foreword to my book, and also I did an interview with her, talked about seeing shadow people out in the TNT area up, just in recent years. And she felt that it maybe had something to do with the Muslim called the jinn. And
I had her on back in 2013, and we talked about that book. Yeah,
it because she wasn't the only one. Ann Druffel out of California, she had looked into the jinn and elementals and such, and the highly respected editor of Flying Saucer Review over in England, Gordon Crichton, really delved into the jinn aspect as well. So I think she, was onto something there, for sure. But whether we call them the jinn or elemental beings or whatever, it's some sort of beings who seem to coexist with us. They have a lot of similarities from all these different, legends, the myths, the religious writings, and so on of these different beings.
Or call them the fairies or the fae. I mean, it's almost essentially they really act the same in many ways.
Yeah, there's they've as Ann Druffel explained, they take a lot of them take a sexual interest in the experiencers. They can appear and disappear and travel great distances very fast, and they have similar appearances in a lot of instances. It's an intriguing consideration. And Valley, who I think Keel said was initially quite skeptical of some of his early writings, began to kind of come around and of course, as I say, wrote Passport to Magonia in 69 and followed in similar footsteps, looking at the alternative aspects and continues to do so to this day, looking at the, Marian apparitions, the shamanic, the elementals, the gnomes, the fairies, all that, all the similarities and the contact experience phenomena.
Yeah. And we're talking about something that's been here, that is a part of this planet, that's probably part of the natural world that we just don't, that we sometimes can interact with. And also too, during the Mothman events, you have the Indrid Cold and Woodrow Derenberger and all that contactee experience that's going on at the same time that, Keel wrote about as well. But
right.
I wanted to ask, what was Keel's conclusion about what was going on there in Point Pleasant? Did he have kind of like his own kind of pet theory?
Well, he certainly felt it was what he called a window, an area where a lot of activity occurs, different fluctuations in the intensity of the activity. And there was something going on with the, some government interest, it seemed, too, at that time. But I don't think he ever really nailed it down, or at least didn't bring that all out in public that much. But there's been a lot of speculations by different people, Andy Coleman being one, about, maybe there were things going on at the TNT area, which was an old World War II ammunition storage area. And there were also, I understand, underground tunnels and operations that couldn't be seen from above ground. Even speculation that they were working on nuclear energy or something. Radioactivity supposedly has been detected around there. And so I don't know about all that, but, it's there could have been some sort of government, military activity going on that we aren't really privy to yet at this time. And then Keel also felt that one of the things that the Air Force did, and he felt it was a logical step, was to, there was such a job in trying to interpret all this data and all these sightings, but he felt that probably what they did was locate sites, which is what he did, to go sky watching in and observe these things for themselves. And you do hear reports about some of these window areas where people report military people on training exercises and such showing up at these areas too, like the San Luis Valley in Colorado and Sedona, Arizona, some real major window areas there. And Keel did a lot of sky watching there around the Point Pleasant area and had some pretty terrific sightings. His best was April 3rd of 1967. It was early morning, and he was sitting alone in his rental car, chewing on a candy bar, listening to the Long John Neville show from New York City, which Long John was the early Art Bell, of course.
He really was. Serafiel's got this album, the Flying Saucer Story, that has a lot of interviews with some of the old contactees like Adamski and George Hunt Williamson and Orfeo Angelucci. It's really fascinating.
But anyway, he saw a dome disc-shaped looking object with these lights around the rim, and he was quite startled. It seemed to go over to a ravine and just sort of get down in there, and he thought maybe it had landed. And it so scared him, he locked all his doors, and he had been flashing his flashlight at some of these lights, and he wrote in his little notepad that he was really scared. He was used to going through graveyards and places late at night, or the TNT area, and on his own, but seeing this object scared the you-know-what out of him. And he sat there for a while, and then finally, of course, he left. But sometimes he'd be joined on these sky watches by a police officer or Mary Heyer, who was a local reporter, a stringer for the Athens Messenger, and had an office there in Point Pleasant. And anyway, he got the local police to go to the place where he thought this thing might have landed. The next day, they couldn't find any trace evidence. They had a Geiger counter, but nothing was detected. But they did have one odd experience. He said that that this strange sound, like a speeded up phonograph record, a voice on a speeded up phonograph record, coming through the police car radio. The odd thing was it was turned off, but yet this came through. And another officer who was there said, "Oh, that happened that night back in when those two couples in the TNT area claimed they saw that creature, the Mothman, which was about 6 months before." And he was interviewing him, and he said the same kind of sound came through his radio. And Keel was noticing a lot of reports of strange voices and sounds coming through radios and television sets and stuff. He was interested in all of that. There was even a communications and an antenna with a control panel and all that was up on a hilltop somewhere. I think it was north of Point Pleasant. I've tried to find out more about this. But anyway, it was seen, this object came down near there and burned some grass. The fire department was trying to get up the hill to get to it, and there had just been some snow, and they were slipping and sliding. And when they got to it, the inside panel was smoldering. They had to replace the unit. And I think there was like a burned area on the hillside near the antenna.
So they were without their communications for a while. And anyway, he had noticed that there were a lot of people who had also gotten strange radio messages. He even heard of people with, like, ham radio operators who were kind of reluctant to share their story normally, but said that they had reported voices coming over their radios, sets claiming to be space beings, and even materializing in their Radio Shacks.
Really? Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
I read that part in your book. That was really, really, really interesting.
I'm a little bit of a shortwave enthusiast, so that's
yeah. So if you get on that shortwave and like an entity appears that's speaking to you, let's talk a little bit about some of the themes in the book. This is interesting, I think, to cover, because this really fascinates me. This idea of like the phone calls from the dead. And you said that you've even gotten some like contact from Keel himself.
Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but and I was very skeptical at first. I tried some EVP stuff in the past, going back to the 70s, and really didn't have a whole lot of success. And in early 2010, I met a gentleman, Brent Raynes, we were doing a paranormal investigation, investigating haunted sites and such. And he had this, what's called a ghost box. It's essentially just a digital radio that you can get from Radio Shack, AM, FM, yep. And you put it on, get it to where it works on continuous scan. And the idea is that, as it passes through the white noise, the spirits can come through and communicate. And so, Keel had passed July 3rd, 2009. And so I was a little curious as to, because Brett Oldham had said, he'd had a lot of success with this. He seemed to have some real psychic sensitivity. He had a ghost experience and even a alien experience going back to about age 5, and other experiences since then. So I thought, okay, this is kind of people that Keel was investigating, So maybe there is this possibility, although, nothing ever seemed to really work for me. But anyway, the first time that we did this was in this the basement of a church about 100 years old over in Fayetteville, Tennessee. And there have been reports of footsteps and the suspicion of ghosts. And and so we tried this. At the time, I didn't think I heard anything that sounded significant. It was only months later that I played the audio back, and I was more used to listening to these sounds, the ghosts, the spirit box, the ghost box, Frank's box, whatever you want to call it, as it scans through the frequencies. And where we were nearing the end of the session, and Brett asked my wife's brother, who had passed on, and people called him Jesse, because Joan had heard Jesse a previous session, if he would like to speak to Joan, my wife. And at that point, instead of hearing his name, a voice came saying, Keel, Johnny. And, well, I was quite surprised because I didn't hear it the first time. And this was a few months later, but by that time, I was already aware of John Keel coming through. We did an investigation at a haunted site in May of that year, 2010. And Brett told me, he said, I just heard John Keel come through, and it happened twice, and played it back, and sure enough, this male voice said John Keel. So what really convinced me, it was July 3rd of 2010, and we were doing a session. This would have been the 1-year anniversary of Keel's passing. And I said, if you guys don't mind, I'd like to try to, reach out to John Keel. Well, I think we had 3 tape recorders going. We had the ghost box hooked up to a stereo speakers. The contents were coming through loud and clear, louder than we had to shout to be heard. And from that, it was toward the beginning that the first session we did two, and Brett asked his guide, a spirit guide or technician, can you have John Keel say his name? And within a second or two, a male voice says, John Keel.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, so at another point, he asked, John, what can you tell us about, now that you're on the other side, what can you tell us about Bigfoot? And this male voice again said, Smuck Bigfoot, see? And yeah, that was pretty surprising. And so I asked about Jeddu, and I says, John, can you tell us anything about Jeddu? And this loud male voice comes through and says, Jeddu, eh? And so by this time, another thing I could think of was that, the only possible explanation was somebody was monitoring, because this was so intelligent, interactive, that somebody had, could have maybe a transmitter for an AM station was transmitting to us from some hidden location, But it was hard to imagine, because after that session, it was several hours before we did another one around midnight. And I was thinking, man, is someone out there that got the house bugged and we're in a different room? They're going to a lot of trouble here. Well, I had to abandon my suspicions, because I got my own ghost box, and I did sessions here at the house, just whenever we felt like it, And I would do sometimes one or two a week for a while there. For several years, I was kind of obsessed with this. One time, this voice said, John Keel, Brent. And then it was followed by Bert here. And Bert, Berthold Schwartz I called him Bert, was a psychiatrist friend of mine who was also a parapsychologist, who also was a good friend of Keel. And soon after Dr. Schwartz passed away in September of 2010, and we were doing these sessions, we'd ask who was there to help with the session, and often for a while there, for about a year, we'd hear Dr. Schwartz as well as Bert. And then that time I got John Keel, Brent, Bert here all in one quick slice. It was very rare to get a full sentence. Occasionally it would happen, and when it did, it was really mind-boggling. I remember one time we were hearing from somebody, we argued as to whether it was Enoch or Enoch. And for about 3 minutes, I was here at the house asking, is it Enoch or Enoch, an I or an O? And then a male voice came through, and I heard it in real time. It said Enoch with an O. And I said, Enoch with an O, holy bloop, it was very clear. And another time Brett had, the way he instructed us was at the end of the session, we'd ask the spirits to say clear when they wanted to discontinue the communications. Just say clear. And we'd listen, and we'd usually get a voice that would say clear. Well, one time, here at the house again, instead of a voice saying clear, a voice told me, this cannot clear, this is energy. And, I reported that to Brett afterwards, and he said, well, that's never happened before. I said, maybe that was a spirit that didn't understand how we were operating. He says, we might have to explain further what we mean by clear. So Keel was always suspicious that these were trickster-type beings, and he knew of someone who got a voice from a medium that came through a medium that sounded very much like a person who had passed away.
Okay.
And Keel really felt that you couldn't trust him, that was just a being that could tap into that person's memories and their voice pattern and such, and pretend to be someone. and provide information that might convince someone that that was who they were. So, if I was to have talked to Keel before he died and said, what if I get a voice, electronic voice effect through a radio that says John Keel, could that be you? And he would have said, no, that's just, I believe that's just those ultra terrestrials,
right.
Pretending.
Yeah, it's a trickster kind of spirit.
Well, and you're opening a door, you're asking for, even if you're asking for a particular thing, if there's other things that are just passing by, like, oh, there's a door, so it seems like they could use whatever you were thinking that you were trying to get a hold of.
There was a fascinating story in the book that you told about Keel, where he spends time with a friend and later finds out that something had happened to that friend earlier, and it's a really creepy story.
Well, yeah, again, this goes back, he was a lifelong atheist, and he was, skeptical about the religious interpretations, but he noticed that they influenced a lot of people, he felt, through their religious beliefs and so on. And so when this happened to him, he'd been doing these investigations, and he'd been getting different messages of things that were going to happen. There was a prediction of a power blackout that was supposed to happen November, let's see, how was it? December 15th, 1967. And he's in his apartment in New York City.
This is when he's getting all these weird prophecies that are coming, and just
and so he's expecting that there's going to be a power blackout, and instead this story comes through the television news bulletin about a bridge collapse on the Ohio River, and he's already suspecting that it's the Silver Bridge there at Point Pleasant that he had crossed over many times himself when investigating there. In fact, he had a motel that he stayed at across the Ohio River. And but at this time, earlier, this old friend of his he hadn't seen in years, who even was his best man at this guy's wedding years earlier, knocked on his door and came in. And, they kind of caught up on old times, had all this guy's memories, was a dead ringer for him. There was no question in Keel's mind that this was his old friend. They even went out to eat later, and they also went to a James Mosley talk that was given.
Yeah.
And I've tried to see if some of the old timers had any pictures from that event, because every time, especially somebody like Jim Mosley, who was a kind of was a celebrity at that time, still is well known. There would have been pictures, and we might have a picture of this guy, but unfortunately, none of the old timers that I know had such. But anyway, it was a couple years later, I guess, he meets the guy's wife in Macy's department store there in New York City. And he tells her that, I saw Joe. And, how's he doing? And she says, I'm sorry, he died of a heart attack, John. And so, then he says, oh, man. He says, he had just seen him, and tells her when it was December of 67. And she said, that's impossible, John. He died of a heart attack in July 1965.
Spent the whole day with him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And John, of course, goes into interrogation mode. Well, are you sure about the date?
Yeah.
And she gets rather indignant and says, John, I was right there when he died. Don't you think I'd know when my husband passed away? And so he writes this letter afterwards to this contact who told me this story to verify that Keel actually did tell this story. And this contact said this was a big guy with a powerful handshake. I was there in the apartment when the guy was there too. and for whatever reason, he didn't want to be identified in this particular story. But I also found out that Tim and John Frick from Maryland were at the Mothman Festival in 2003 when Keel was there. They spent about 8 hours with him and covered a lot of things. And at that time, John Keel told him the story that I just shared with you. He didn't tell him the name of the person at the time, but it was the same identical story. And John said something to him about, wow, that must have been something else. What do you think? What do you think that meant, or what do you think this means? And Keel said, it hurts my head too much to, dwell on it for very long.
Well, I mean, if you read Mothman Prophecies, I mean, he's very much like going through this like nexus of weirdness. I mean, everything, all these synchronicities and all these like prophecies, and he's listening to them, and then he figures out eventually that it's just, what does he say in the book? He says something like it's a broken record that just is just on a constant loop. Is how he terms it, that there's this like it's essentially nonsense, or at least the way it comes down to us is essentially nonsense.
Yeah, he learned to kind of approach it cautiously, because he said they could know the future, but they would just give you so much information.
Right.
Then they'd give you the big event, and if you went to the press about it, it would be, he called it the tiger behind the door of prophecy. It wouldn't happen, and he cited different instances where people had ruined their reputations by going forward, and I know a guy over here in Pulaski, Tennessee. He wrote a column for the Pulaski Citizen, and he talked with contactees in his area back in the 70s, and he got a message that there was going to be a powerful earthquake, and he put it in the newspaper, the date and everything, and then but it didn't happen. And then he became kind of like the fool on the hill afterwards.
Yeah. Let's move on to something that I found interesting in the book that this guy's name, Haakon Blomqvist. Is that his name?
Haakon Blomqvist, or however you want to pronounce it. I may not be pronouncing it 100% right either.
Well, he has this idea called the esoteric intervention theory, and I kind of want to go over that, because one of the things we talk a lot about on this show is the occult stuff, and this has a lot to do with theosophy and such.
Right, and he's very, very knowledgeable on all that, very well read, and he met Keel when Keel came over there and visited Sweden in '76. I think he spent a couple nights in visiting Haakon Blomqvist and some of his friends in Haakon's apartment, and he felt as though that maybe if Keel had maybe known a little more about esoteric traditions, it might have helped him to figure it out a little better, and that it wasn't always maybe such a negative thing. But anyway, I think he has kind of a perspective, as I've mentioned, my friend Dr. Greg Little, a Memphis psychologist who studied extensively on Native American traditions and sites. He's even written an encyclopedia on ancient mounds and earthworks. And of the Native American trickster, he says the Native Americans saw the trickster as also potentially a teacher. Yes. And it would test you to see if you were worthy of higher knowledge and understanding, or if maybe your ego was going to get the best of you, or there would be a testing process, say in the beginning of a vision quest and other events. And so it may be that some of these things are along that line, and the Native American traditions, shamanism, the esoteric traditions, and so on. That it's not all necessarily bad as Keel had perceived it, although some of the stories heard certainly were not good. But maybe it's like what we find among humans. There's good and bad too.
Well, and this idea of having to go through trials and, having to pass through negative things.
Right.
That's especially true in both the mystery schools and in more traditional peoples throughout the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of times there's the symbolic ritual of the death ritual, the dying away of
right.
of what is, and then the renewal, or like the phoenix rising from the ashes, recreating a new destiny for yourself.
What was Keel's take on the occult and kind of like Western esotericism?
Well, he had a really dim view. I asked him one time when we were talking on the phone, and I had brought up the subject of Marian apparitions, and I knew he had studied this.
Right.
He'd presented quite a number of cases in his Operation Short Journalist back in 1970. And I said, you talk about, the tricksters, you talk about demonic type events or, activity with these things. And I says, what about something positive? And he said that he had never really, he said even the Marian apparitions and such, the holy events, turned sour in the end, he felt. And he said that years earlier, and I think he asked me if I had ever got his letter, and I said no, but they did send around a letter to different people back in the late 60s explaining his concern that what we were dealing with didn't have our best interests at heart.
Well, do you think it almost seems like he has this kind of, I don't know how to explain exactly, like almost a dark spirituality that almost borders on maybe some type of elements of Gnosticism or things like that, where like we're kind of this, we're kind of just screwed, and we're trapped in this oppressive reality.
I had sent him a copy of my first book, published in 2004, Visitors from Hidden Realms, and he wrote me a little card, and handwritten, and it said appreciated me. He said sending him the book, and he enjoyed it. He said that my journey had been pretty much like his. You just come as close as you can to an interpretation, but nothing's ironclad. But he said that things looked very dim, that, religion was going to fail us, and people were just clinging to false hope. It was pretty dark indeed. And of course, with typical Keel humory, on the cover of the card was a young boy with it was all snow and ice outside, and he had his tongue stuck to a metal pole. In fact, I remember calling Keel on the phone one time. I got his answering machine, and he says, I can't come to the telephone right now. I'm out here in the back alley taking pot shots at pedestrians going up and down the sidewalk. I'll get back with you.
Would you describe him as kind of an existentialist? His ideas of how the universe actually works, does that kind of tie in with existentialist ideas of the absurd? Like he thinks that reality is absurd and kind of just pitted against us, and even on multiple dimensional levels.
Well, I mean, I think when he's dealing with all this stuff, if you read Mothman prophecies, I mean, you can tell that that's where he's going.
Yeah.
That is everything, just that he gets really wrapped up in what these entities or whatever are telling him. So much so that he starts to really just believe it, but then he realizes he's just on a wild goose chase. Right. It's just they're just messing with him, and I think that's probably where it starts. It probably starts for him right then and there.
Yeah, he was that experience he had meeting a friend who he found out had been dead over 2 years before. That would have, for most people, that would have been a very profound and positive spiritual thing. But for Keel, No, he had a very difficult time with that from what he said to the Frick brothers and shared with the guy that was in his apartment that time. So, yeah, his perception of it was very dark. I mean, we're standing on his shoulders today. He was a true pioneer who led the pack in pursuing the areas he did. But at the same time, I mean, I tell people that I try to take a more positive, optimistic view of the phenomenon in the future. But I admit there's things that make you certainly wonder, and you've got to follow in his footsteps and ask these questions and pursue these perplexing cases, I feel, to whatever logical conclusion lies ahead. But I feel that he just his atheistic perspective just prevented him from really, and he just felt like these were, even though he was not really a believer in demons, he felt that they played all these reality games with us, and whatever frame of reference that could kind of pacify the experiencer, then that's what they would employ. He called it at one point psychological warfare tactics, which he said he learned a little about when he was in the Army, and he felt they were manipulating us. That a lot of these contact experiences were actually variations of religious phenomena like Marian apparitions or the fairy encounters, which involved missing time and sexual elements and all the same classics of the UFO contact experience, those same elements being a part of the syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at other people too, like, it's like somebody like Philip K. Dick and the whole Valis stuff, as they just got more and more wrapped up into this nexus of weirdness. And Keel, talks a lot about that. It's
well, Keel was even thinking about writing a book about witches and warlocks, because he wrote that, early in his life, he felt like he had the potential for maybe having interaction and partially controlling these elemental beings himself. He wrote to Colin Wilson about this, and he wanted to do a book where he was interviewing those people and about their experiences, but he might have started to do that research, but certainly there never was a book that appeared on that subject. But he had experiences early on with a poltergeist in the farmhouse where he grew up with his, largely with his grandparents. He had a sighting of a large spherical object rising up from a hilltop when he was only 7. But he says the memory that's burned in his memory is, his memory. When he was 18, he had a classic illumination experience where this room he was at off of Times Square became filled with this indescribable light, and his mind was flooded with a torrent of information. By the next morning, though, he could only just remember a little bit, but he felt like something was downloaded in his subconscious. And again, that would have been an experience that a lot of people would have felt was a powerful religious thing, but he didn't pursue that aspect, even though he was exposed to it. When he was also very young, the place that he grew up at, people reported I think when he was 10 years old, like a gorilla crossing the road there in that town, and people were quite frightened by the encounters. And of course, now he looks back at it and says it was probably Bigfoot.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because you mentioned that he's had that Yeti experience when he's out there in Tibet, and what you just talked about, and it seems like he himself almost was like a catalyst for this weirdness to be drawn to him.
Yeah,
or he was drawn to
Yeah,
it. I mean, I guess, or vice
that's
versa.
something that Rosemary Guiley wrote in her foreword, was that, she knew Keel and spent quite a bit of time with him. And she says he often talked about how a lot of the experiences were wired a certain way that made him prone to these experiences, but he never talked about himself. But she felt that certainly he was one of those individuals as well, and that it probably helped him to recognize a lot of the same elements within his own life experiences, and it maybe helped him to make, I would say, the connections better.
And the Mothman events are going on, so was he just drawn into that, into that high strangeness?
Yeah, in fact, it seems like this lama that he met over, in his travels back there in the 1950s when he was doing the Jadoo thing, that the one that could read his mind, and then he was trying to learn what he could because he was considered a very sacred person, and he was mystified by him, and he really wanted to understand how he was able to do what he did. In fact, while the guy was talking to Keel, and I think he was an older fellow, and he had this walking stick, and he raised himself up on this walking stick and just sort of hovered there in the air, which Keel thought was an amazing feat to observe, because here they were having this long conversation, and this guy was acting like it was nothing to, rise himself up on this stick and have this conversation and read Keel's mind and stuff and tell him how it was done.
Let's talk a little bit about your own kind of personal Men in Black encounter that you had.
Well, who are the Men in Black? Keel had felt that they were like the entities, I guess. The Men in Black, he felt like that if he could, because I think there were 2 or 3 occasions where he arrived just minutes after an MIB had allegedly been visiting a witness, and he really wanted to actually corner one to find an MIB that he could actually approach and talk to and get. He knew that it was going to be impossible to catch one of the little guys from the flying saucer, but maybe he might stand a chance to catch an MIB, who he felt, the MIB, some of them were possibly people who were under the control influence of these ultra-terrestrials. So he thought maybe he could find out something. I met a couple of people who claimed that they were MIB, or felt they filled a context within that regard. There were 2 people in near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that I met in 1972. They were one was a psychiatric social worker who was a ufologist, and she had been through a series of MIB experiences, her and her family, and poltergeist type of activity. And another was a young UFO researcher named Floyd Murray, who has since passed on. But they both knew about these 2 gentlemen who a lot of people felt had great psychic energy. And this woman said that, one of them even resembled MIB right down to the monotone voice. And some people were actually scared of him because of the psychic power. There was one woman told me, and this was in the witchcraft community, that she had met him on the astral plane as a hooded monk-like figure, and to be very careful, in dealings with him. And so I got to interview some of those people, and this psychiatric social worker told me she called them genies. And she said that they helped to rid her family of their MIB problems when they were having problems. They were a much more sociable group of people, she said, these two gentlemen. And she felt that there was something there that, in fact, she would send messages, I found out, from one of them to John Keel, little warnings and such, whatever that consisted of. And I never did find out. I've recently asked Doug Skinner if he ever sees anything like that with the material that's left in his possession to let me know, but he said he hadn't. And in hindsight, I look back at it and think, damn, when I talked to John Keel, that was something I should have asked him about, but never did. Tell him this story. But anyway, while I was down there, we stopped Floyd Murray and myself and my friend David, who came with me on this journey. We both lived in Maine at the time. We were traveling down to Long Island and to Pennsylvania, and so here we are in Pennsylvania, and we're visiting this New Age center where people were gathered, and it was going to be closing in a while, and Floyd thought he was going to talk with someone, and maybe it was supposed to be the building was supposed to be haunted, and maybe we'd just spend the night. That is until suddenly Floyd comes to me and says, "Hey, Brent, I want you to meet somebody." And I come out the door, and there's a car parked there, and he opens the door and almost shoves me in, I felt like, into this front seat with this guy sitting there. And it turned out he was the guy that these two people said was like, the sociable MIB type. And so I started questioning him, and, and everything I'd say to him was just very general. Do you have out-of-body experiences? Yes. Okay. And it was just he says, why don't I start, this isn't working out too good for you. He says, why don't I start asking you questions? I said, okay, yeah, sure. That'll work. And he started talking about, my interest in contacts and the Men in Black. And he was especially interested in the Men in Black, of course. And he says, like right now, if I were an MIB, I could be preventing you from being somewhere where something else was going on. And I immediately thought about, the haunted house thing, yeah, which we didn't get to do because the place closed down by the time I got out of the car. And he went from being really serious for a while, and then started talking about, gee, what would it be like to see if to make sure the MIB wasn't a robot, like maybe try to cut off one of its fingers, and they started this weird laugh, and then he turned the heater on his car, and I'd decide at that point, okay, I've had enough. I'll see you later.
It's just so weird. So strange.
And then I was in the Navy at the time, and it was in Florida, Jacksonville, Florida area, Jacksonville Beach. And a friend of mine on the ship told me that he had been downtown there, and the ship was homeported in Mayport nearby, a few miles away. And he had been down by the bus station. He met this real interesting guy, gave him a business card with his contact information, and he said all he wanted to do was talk about flying saucers and stuff. So I says, well, thanks, I'll follow up on it. And I went to the house, and he wasn't there the first time I went, but I talked to his mother, and she told me about seeing these two like Ferris wheels going down the beach up in the air, just spinning around with these lights on them, Said the neighbor across the street seen it too. And so anyway, I eventually went back, and this time the guy was home, and he claimed that he had a encounter where some years earlier where he made contact, and these two beings, a male and a female, had entered him, and he was like in constant contact, and he described.
So, like, they possessed him?
He's claimed he was possessed, but he was, me and a Navy buddy of mine, we went out with him to different clubs, and he was dressed in dark clothing, and he even told at that point that he also worked as an MIB. I said, okay. And he would just go up to perfect strangers and start telling them about the space people and stuff. And unbelievably, people seemed to enjoy his stories. He didn't get kicked out of any clubs, as weird as it sounded. And but I wasn't able to, I spent several hours with him, wasn't really able to say whether, how much was delusional, how much, was maybe what Keel was looking for. But his mother...
Or somewhere in between.
His mother was, she described the two UFOs that she had seen. And she seemed quite sensible, and the only thing about him that was usual was just his openness and walking around like it was nothing to say, yeah, I've met the space people. I know this alien woman and this man that I communicate with regularly, and that was it. He kind of an interesting character. The area there around Jacksonville Beach seemed to have a lot of people with a lot of stories. I met Ramona Clark at the time. She later became Ramona Hebner. She had a very interesting experience. She was married to a Navy man at the time of the experience, and in July '67, saw a dome disc-shaped craft. It was seen by some other people nearby. It was right by the base. People thought at first it was a plane coming in for landing. Turned out to be a dome disc-shaped dark gray object about 35 feet across. And it ended up at one point just right over the top of their car. And within about 3 days after that experience, they had all this weird poltergeist type activity. And it started with sounds and odors, and eventually worked up to 3 a.m. encounters with balls of light in the bedroom and a being by the side of her bed that kind of did a little shape-shifting. At first, it resembled someone she knew, and then it seemed to take the form of this creature with a cat-like face, which was interesting because I later met a guy who claimed nearby that he had this encounter with a being with a cat-like face that paralyzed him with a beam of light, and he began to have all these strange dreams at 3 o'clock in the morning as well.
Like stranger than what happened with the guy with the cat.
Yeah.
Paralyzing him with a beam of light.
Yeah, he was fishing down at a place called Blunt Island, and he...
that happened, but I had some really strange dreams too.
Yes. Oh, the dreams. Yeah, he was being told these things about the planet Mars. They were going to find a pyramid and some evidence of ancient ruins and stuff, And he was seeing one of the aliens in these very lucid dreams at 3 o'clock, and he really, and he was also claimed that when, I think it was back in 1947 as a young boy up near Atlanta, Georgia, that he liked to explore caves, and at the time he encountered 3 of these beings with a cat-like face, and at the time he assumed they were demons. He was in a cave and he encountered 3, and it scared him real bad, and he couldn't wait to get out of the cave. And then he had this experience 1972 while he was fishing there on the St. Johns River in Florida, and there was a UFO. It started off with a UFO, and then there was the being. So he realized, oh, they weren't devils. They were, it was an alien.
This just seems like that's very much like the trickster quality of this material.
Yeah, and he was, I noticed he was also involved for years in different aspects of witchcraft. That he was kind of into witchcraft like some of these other people, and Keel noticed that there were a lot of similarities between historical MIB encounters involved in incidents in the witchcraft literature, demonology, and even back in it was around the winter of 1904-05. There was this huge religious revival in Wales where all these UFO type phenomena was occurring, and there was even one report by two people that said they'd seen this dark, sinister-looking male figure, and a ball of light came down and shot a beam of light at this figure who was believed to be the devil, and he disintegrated.
Well, really get into the weeds on some of this stuff, Brent. I mean, this is fascinating material. We need to have you back on because there's a lot in this book, and there's a lot that we need to explore and I really want to talk to you about some of this stuff about like the Indian mounds and ley lines and earth energies and all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
I mean, we need to do something about that. And of course, as we're recording this, this is going to be put out after the Strange Realities Conference, but we are going to see you in just a few days. So but we can sit down and talk about some of that stuff too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to it. It's going to be interesting. I hope you get a huge crowd there. And
as do we.
Yes. It should be interesting. Be interesting.
Tell people where they can find the book and also where they can find you. And are you still publishing your online magazine?
Yes, I've been at this magazine since 1985. I started out as Para-Ufology Forum, usually a 4-page print bulletin, and it's graduated up to this online magazine. Comes out on the first of each month, and then we archive the previous issue. So we've got several years of back issues that are online, and we always have a series of different columns, guest submissions, articles, and interviews, and book reviews, and letters to the editor when someone bothers to write us, and. Comes out once a month, and it's free of charge.
Wow, nice.
And it's called Alternate Perceptions, and it's at apmagazine.info is the website. And it's because the book itself, John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries, is available on Amazon, and I self-published it on Kindle. And it's been available since July 14th, and it's getting a lot of great reviews. I can't believe it. I got 7 5-star reviews right now. I didn't expect that with running a book on John Keel, but he's, like I said, I think if he were back now writing his articles, his books, that he would be better received. There's more of an interest in the areas that he explored years ago. Going back 50 years.
Is there anybody now that you follow that you think would be like kind of like a worthy successor to Keel?
Well, there's certainly a number of people up in that attend the Mothman Festival every year. In fact, they're really involved. Rosemary Guiley, she used to meet with them also. They would attend the Mothman Festival every September if they could, and then they would be also involved getting together on their own personal investigations. It might be somewhere in New York State or somewhere else in West Virginia. But there's Steve Ward, who lives up in Michigan, and then there's
oh yeah, I know about Steve.
And then there's
I need to get Steve on.
Tim and John Frick, who live in Maryland, and they of course met Keel in 2003, and they've been devouring his material, and they dress up as the Men in Black at every festival, and they also created this. When they do the hay rides out in the TNT area, they've got this made up thing to look like Mothman with glowing eyes that they send across over their heads to people on the hay rides on a line. And they also, when I was there in 2015, went for one of the hay rides, which my ride actually didn't have any hay, but I'm not complaining. But these guys in a golf cart come up, these young guys dressed as MIBs, and warned us to stay out of there, not to go any further. But, my grandson stood up. He was about 9, I guess, and told him, "I'm not afraid of you." And they went off on their merry way after that. So,
well, Brent, this is...
so they weren't too frightening.
No, not menacing at all. Well, Brent, this has been very interesting. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me, the both of you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, sir. All right, well, stay on the line for us. We're going to close out this section, and guys, we'll be back to close out the show on Conspirinormal.
If you want your HR team to hire top talent for your company, tell them about ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology identifies people with the right skills, education, and experience, and actively invites them to apply to your company's job posts, so you get qualified candidates fast. It's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is rated #1 by employers in the U.S. This rating comes from hiring sites on Trustpilot with over 1,000 reviews. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Okay, we're back, guys. And that was an interesting conversation with Brent Raynes.
Absolutely.
Glad to have him, and I'm sure in the past or the future, we're glad to have met him at the Strange Realities Conference. And
it was nice meeting you, Brent.
It was nice meeting you. Yes, absolutely. Any impressions on that interview?
Oh, that was really cool, because I'm familiar with a lot of John Keel's ideas, and I've read some, but to get that kind of background on who he was as a person in his life, it was really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we just did something that you guys, I'm sure, have already heard, but we were just on Strange Familiars with Tim, and we talked about the Strange Realities Conference, which, as you're hearing this, has already happened. I'm getting really confused.
And it
Partly
was...
because I'm tired.
It was...
Epic. And there were no disasters, hopefully.
There was no disasters. Everything was seamless.
Yeah, something like that. I'm sure that you'll know what exactly happened at some point.
Adam, I keep getting you to try to visualize the stuff with me,
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what it is.
Gotta be.
Sorry, I thought it was the... I didn't know it was we were engaging in new thought there. Okay. I thought we were still confused. But...
And this is kind of like a time ritual too, man.
True. Yeah.
Do like a time ritual with it.
Good point. Yeah, we're sending...
Since this is in the future.
We're sending our energy and thoughts into the future.
But you've got to completely feel.
Okay, yeah.
You've got to completely feel it inside of you.
Is that what Napoleon Hill says?
You are in the future right now, and the Strange Realities Conference just happened.
Right. Yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah. It's October 29th, and it's already it's 10 days later, and it's already happened. Okay. Yeah. All right. I got you. All right.
We're just putting that out there.
I see how that goes. So we did an interview with a little roundtable discussion with Soraya from Where Did the Road Go, and Timothy Renner, who joined us at the Strange Realities Conference 2019. On Strange Familiars. So you guys, if you've not heard that yet, go check that out. It was a really good discussion.
Then we were also what was that obscure radio show that we were on also?
Oh, yeah.
Last
we need to
night?
mention that. We need to mention that. Right. So we may have picked up some new listeners because we got to be on Coast to Coast.
Yeah.
Very briefly. We were on there for 3 minutes, 1 minute of which was a clip that we put together.
Yeah.
From our interview where we spoke at the end of the Diana Pazuka interview. Yeah, we got to be the podcast of the week on Coast to Coast. We got to talk to George Norrie for a couple minutes.
It's pretty wild. We got to hear the chase theme over the phone.
Yeah,
as Coast to Coast came in, and so like that was pretty epic to me. I haven't heard that since I was like in 7th grade, so that was pretty awesome.
That's the big daddy of all pretty much paranormal radio shows.
Biggest in town.
Yeah, they are been around. So
we
for
really
a long,
appreciate
long
it, and all the new listeners we have from Coast to Coast. Welcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
We hope you like these shows. We got a lot to check out for free anywhere you listen to podcasts.
So if you're interested, guys, in supporting our show, we have a Patreon. That's at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal. It's as little as $1 a month, and you have access to I believe we're up to about 30 smaller episodes, Patreon-only episodes that you guys can check out on there. If everybody gives $1, that really does help us. That's why we try to keep it low. It's up to you whether you want to give us more. There's also, if you don't want to have a recurring thing, some people don't, you can go to conspirinormal.com, and there is a donation button there on our website as well. And also, YouTube channel, also available, Conspirinormal Podcast. Please subscribe there. We're upwards of about, as I'm recording this, upwards of about 700 subscribers. Just hit that button. That'll really help us, hopefully, in the long run. And leave an iTunes review if you feel compelled to do so.
Plus,
hopefully a positive one.
We've got t-shirts.
We do. Yeah, please tell everybody about that.
You can go to tpublic.com/store/Conspirinormal store.
Of which we sold one as we were recording this evening.
What'd they get? Which one?
I've
got the skull with the fez and the Bigfoot with the fez.
Yeah, I think it's the Bigfoot.
Okay.
It's the Bigfoot.
What color did they get?
Red, I believe.
Cool.
Let's see. TeePublic. They bought a baseball and Bigfoot and Conspirinormal logo. It does not say what color.
Okay, cool.
Okay, well, that's basically it, guys. We're going to have some great shows for you as we round out the year, and we're really looking forward to that. We loved doing the conference, but we're glad to get back to just doing the Conspirinormal for a little while.
That's right.
So, all right, guys, have a good night, and we'll talk to you soon on Conspirinormal.
Please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel